Laura and Tammy had been friends since they were little girls. Growing up together, they shared so many memories, but there was always an unspoken tension between them. Tammy, coming from a wealthy family, always felt the need to compete with Laura, who, despite coming from a similarly affluent background, never flaunted it. Laura had always been considered the more attractive of the two, and in high school, boys would ask her out first, which Tammy silently resented. Still, Laura saw Tammy as a close friend, even if others might have noticed the imbalance in their relationship. In college, their dynamic shifted but continued. Tammy had a string of boyfriends, but none of her relationships ever lasted. Many broke up with her due to her bossy demeanor, while others cheated. Meanwhile, in their sophomore year, Laura met Scott, a transfer student who played on the football team. He was charming, kind, and treated her the way every girl dreamed of being treated. Soon, they were inseparable, and their love blossomed. Tammy, as always, grew jealous. She constantly tried to undermine Laura's relationship with Scott, calling him poor and untrustworthy. She told Laura that Scott looked like the type to cheat, but Laura ignored her. She loved Scott and didn't care about his wealth or status. They were happy together, and that was all that mattered. One weekend, Laura went home to celebrate her grandmother's birthday, leaving her phone behind by accident. While she was away, Tammy threw a party and invited Scott. Since Tammy and Laura were friends, Scott didn't think twice about attending. Tammy had other intentions. She gave Scott a drink and encouraged him to loosen up, suggesting that Laura was off having fun elsewhere. After some hesitation, Scott drank it, unaware of what was coming. The next morning, Scott woke up with a pounding headache, naked in a bed with another young woman he didn't know. The girl beside him stared at him, equally confused. The last thing either of them remembered was Tammy giving them drinks. Meanwhile, Laura returned to campus and picked up her phone, horrified to see several missed calls and messages. One message in particular stood out: a series of photos showing Scott in bed with another girl. Her heart broke in pieces. She dropped her phone and collapsed into tears. Moments later, Tammy knocked on her door, feigning concern when Laura showed her the photos. "I told you he was no good," Tammy said with a smirk hidden behind fake sympathy. She urged Laura to break up with him, continuously painting Scott as a cheater and a liar. Hurt and overwhelmed, Laura blocked Scott from her phone and social media accounts, not giving him a chance to explain. She transferred to another college, disappearing without telling anyone where she went, not even Tammy. For weeks, Scott tried to reach Laura, desperate to explain what happened, but his calls were unanswered and his messages ignored. He couldn't understand why Laura had suddenly shut him out. Meanwhile, Tammy began inserting herself into his life, offering comfort and playing the role of the supportive friend. She invited him out to lunch and dinner, slowly trying to work her way into his life. Scott, still heartbroken over losing Laura, didn't suspect anything until one day. While out at a restaurant with Tammy, he noticed a group of students whispering and looking at them. When Tammy went to the restroom, Scott approached them, asking why they were staring. One of the students, a young man, hesitated before asking, "Are you dating Tammy?" Scott furrowed his brow, unsure of where the conversation was headed. "Why do you want to know?" he asked. The young man looked uncomfortable but finally said, "Everyone knows what she did. Tammy's the one who drugged you and that girl at the party. She's the reason you ended up in that mess." Scott's heart raced as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Tammy had been behind everything. Later that night, Scott confronted Tammy about what he had learned. She tried to laugh it off, saying it had been a harmless prank, but Scott saw through her lies. "Stay away from me, Tammy," he said firmly. "You destroyed my relationship with Laura, and I'll never forgive you for that." Tammy tried to argue, but Scott had already walked away, leaving her standing alone, defeated. Scott spent the next several weeks searching for Laura, desperate to make things right. He didn't know where she had transferred, but he wasn't going to give up. He reached out to mutual friends and eventually learned that she was attending a university out of state. With newfound hope, Scott decided to take a chance and visit her. He drove hours to find her, showing up unannounced at her new campus. His heart pounded as he knocked on the door of her dorm room, unsure of what he would say when she opened the door. When Laura saw Scott standing there, she froze in shock. Her first instinct was to close the door, but Scott quickly spoke up. "Please, Laura, just give me a few minutes to explain." She hesitated, but something in his eyes made her listen. Reluctantly, she stepped aside, letting him in. Scott explained everything: the party, the drink, waking up confused, and finally discovering that Tammy had orchestrated the whole thing. He told Laura that he had no memory of what had happened that night and that he would never willingly betray her. Laura listened quietly, her emotions in turmoil. She had spent months trying to move on, but hearing Scott's side of the story shook her. When Scott finished, he looked at her with pleading eyes. "I love you, Laura," he said softly. "I've never stopped loving you. I would never hurt you like that." Tears welled up in Laura's eyes as she took in his words. The betrayal she had felt for so long began to dissolve, replaced by the realization that Tammy had manipulated everything. It hurt to think her friend had done this, but the truth brought her some peace. "I love you too, Scott," she whispered. I don't know how to trust again." Scott gently took her hands in his. "We can take it slow, one step at a time. But I promise you, I'll never let anyone come between us again." Laura smiled through her tears, feeling the warmth of his sincerity. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of hope. Laura and Scott decided to give their relationship another chance, taking things one day at a time. They slowly rebuilt the trust that had been shattered by Tammy's betrayal. Scott transferred to the same university as Laura, and together they navigated their new life, stronger than before. As for Tammy, she faded from their lives. Her attempts to manipulate others had finally caught up with her, and she found herself isolated. Laura never spoke to her again, realizing that some friendships aren't worth saving. In the end, Laura and Scott's love endured. They graduated from college together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever challenges life would throw their way. Through betrayal and heartbreak, they had found their way back to each other, proving that true love, when tested, can come out even stronger on the other side.